Yeah, hey, look. Um, so let's go ahead and talk about affirmative action. This is how we're going to end the section of racial discrimination, and also end the class today, is by looking at various different areas in which affirmative action has applied, ending, not shockingly, in the area of education and higher education one more time. So affirmative action is sort of has a pretty broad definition. And it describes a system which gives advantages to individuals whom are part of a racial or ethnic minority. It's not clear, and of course I say it's not clear because it's really evolved over time, about what sort of affirmative action programs are admissible and meet the 14th Amendment. Because understand, 14th Amendment requires equal protection under the law. And one could very easily see, and we'll see in the course, in the next few cases that we do, that you could have a system that is designed to give advantages to individuals who are racial minorities, yet also violates the 14th Amendment. So it's been sort of a moving standard for the court in terms of what sorts of laws you can craft. So looking again to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we know that Title VII prohibits employment-based discrimination, and that's really where we're going to start looking in the next case, is at employment-based discrimination. So the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, was created to investigate these cases and bring liable employers. So individuals who were discriminating on another basis of employment, their cases worked their way through the EEOC. Title VII also states that in some areas, preferential treatment of African Americans will be required. It doesn't really outline any true guidelines outside of making the argument that, or the claim that, there may be some areas in which preferential treatment of African Americans will be needed to overcome a history of previous discrimination. So while the Civil Rights Act doesn't provide any true guidance in terms of what sort of remedies are going to be included under this preferential treatment, it does provide at least a foundational justification for affirmative action type laws. So the first one we're going to look at happens in Griggs versus Duke Power Company, a case in 1971. You have to remember, this is Chief Justice Berger has now joined the court. This is a Nixon court, and Chief Justice Berger writes this opinion, and it happens to be unanimous. So simple background for the case. To work for Duke Power Company, a high school diploma was required for manual labor jobs, along with sufficient grades on certain aptitude tests. So there existed a law in North Carolina, Duke Power Company, by the way, North Carolina, that this is not just a law, the employer, the employer, Duke Power Company, had a requirement that for manual labor jobs, you had to have a high school diploma, plus your grades had to be sufficient on certain sort of aptitude tests. I don't have to tell you that the ability of someone to, let's say, lay wire in regards to a power company is not very closely related to having a high school diploma or passing certain aptitude tests. Your ability to write a coherent sentence does not affect your ability to actually dig a trench and lay wire. So these laws, or this rule, was in effect intended to exclude African Americans. So the Supreme Court, so basically the question in this is, does this requirement of a high school diploma and the passage of certain aptitude tests run afoul of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? And the Supreme Court unanimously says, yes, it does. The Supreme Court rules that hiring practices which are not job related and which operate to exclude African Americans from the workforce are absolutely prohibited. Looking at the factual history of this case, they recognize that there was no need for a high school diploma or certain aptitude tests. And the reason why this requirement was put in place by the power company was to exclude African Americans. The court argues that the object of Title VII was to, quote, achieve equality of employment opportunities and remove barriers that have operated in the past to favor an identifiable group of white employees over other employees. Thus, neutral practices, and they argue that this practice is neutral because it is not facially discriminatory, but thus even these neutral practices cannot be maintained if they operate to freeze the status quo, that status quo being discriminating in terms of employment practices by excluding African Americans. The Supreme Court in this case sets the standard of disparate impact. And they argue that if the disparate impact of the employer's actions are to ultimately not disenfranchise, but to not include African Americans, if the disparate impact of their action is to not include a number of African Americans, then that is the standard by which we should judge, and not whether there was discriminatory intent on behalf of the employer. So this goes beyond the reading or the understanding of the rule, because the rule is not by its nature discriminatory, but the disparate impact was discriminatory. And that's why this rule or this practice by the power company went in violation of Title VII. Understand that disparate impact is extremely employee-oriented because it means that the employer has to demonstrate that it's not just that its practice is neutral, but also that its practice does not negatively affect employment by African Americans. So disparate impact empowers employees because the employer has to demonstrate that its rule is actually neutral, and also that its rule doesn't negatively affect African Americans. So disparate impact is actually fairly difficult for employers to actually demonstrate that they have met this sort of standard. As an aside, the Supreme Court also said that in this case, that less qualified minority candidates should not be given preference over non-minorities who are better qualified. So in one side, they say this practice of requiring a high school diploma and certain aptitude tests has the disparate impact of affecting African Americans in terms of employment. However, less qualified minorities should not be given preferences over non-minorities who are better qualified. Now, that seems to go both ways. How do you determine qualifications? Well, the qualification is entirely job-oriented. So in this regard, the needs of the job were manual labor. If you could demonstrate that you could do said manual labor, you were qualified. But you could easily see, I think, a situation in which the requirement was a higher standard. So not manual labor, but a very particularized type of labor that requires a significant amount of training that hadn't been traditionally available to individuals who were African American. Let's say, for example, I don't know, medical school. And so if your requirement is that you have to have you have to be qualified, if the nature of those qualifications are already discriminatory, then using that qualification would also be discriminatory. So this case is important in that it very clearly states that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is absolutely enforceable. It also puts a barrier up against its enforcement. They say that, so boil it down to it's very simple. Even though the court says that preferences should not be used, Title VII says that preferences should be used sometimes. And the court doesn't provide a lot of guidance to that end, because it might be that those qualifications that are required are by their nature discriminatory. And so certain preferences might be empowered to give, and Title VII certainly empowers in that area. But the court here says that no, really the only barrier should be qualified versus not qualified. And it's not at all clear how you overcome that qualification.